In the last week of June 1972, wheat harvest in Russell County, Kansas, was at its peak. Every morning at dawn, a line formed outside Kessler Grain and Storage on US 281. Trucks idling, augers turning, a cloud of dust hanging over the elevator's white concrete silos. The price was low. $1.34 a bushel, and it hadn't changed much in 5 years. Selling wasn't a choice. Loan payments, seed debt, fuel bills, those got paid the day your wheat went into the elevator. A man who believed there was no other way never looked for one. Every year, the same cycle repeated until one man stepped out of it. That week, 63 farmers ran their wheat across the elevator's bulk scale, but the 64th farmer never showed. His name was Glenn Hadley. That morning, he drove his truck past Kessler's without slowing down. Didn't look back, didn't ease off the gas, didn't hesitate. A few men in the yard watched him pass, but nobody said a word. They didn't need to. That evening, when Lloyd Kessler sat down at his corner table at Dinah's Café in Bunker Hill, he brought the subject up himself, right there in front of everyone. To understand why Glenn Hadley didn't stop that morning, you need to know his family, especially his grandfather, August. Glenn was born in 1918, 11 miles southwest of Russell, on a 320-acre farm off Paradise Road. His father died of a heart attack in 1934, when Glenn was 16. Left behind the land and the debt that came with it. But the man who held that ground together was Glenn's grandfather, August. Emigrated from Germany in 1889. One of the first turkey red wheat growers in Russell County. A man who carried the Dust Bowl on his back. In 1936, August sat his grandson down in front of the old grain bin behind the barn and told him this: when everybody sells at the same time, the price drops. When everybody gets scared at the same time, it drops even further. But fear passes. Winter ends, and come March, somebody always needs wheat. The man who can store his own grain sets his own price. Glenn never wrote that sentence in his notebook. He didn't need to. August had already proven it across the winters of 1933, 1934, 1935, and 1936, selling his stored wheat at spring prices each time. By 1972, Glenn was 54 years old. He farmed 320 acres of scout wheat with his wife, Clara. He owned a 1958 Chevrolet Apache truck and a 1962 John Deere 4010 tractor, and not much else worth counting. He had no line of credit at the bank, never opened one. His equipment was old, but it ran. Clara worked part-time at the post office in town, and at the end of every month, she put $47 into a tin box in the kitchen drawer and called it winter money. Glenn's standing among the local farmers was mixed. Nobody spoke badly of him, but nobody held him up as an example either. Small operation, old equipment, no credit. In Russell County, that either meant you were very smart or very stubborn. Most people believed it was the latter. Understanding Lloyd Kessler matters because Lloyd was not a simple villain. He was the second-generation owner of the biggest grain elevator in Russell County. His father, Irwin, had bought the lot on US 281 in 1946. When Lloyd took over the business in 1964, he expanded the capacity to 200,000 bushels. His scales were calibrated, his grading was honest, his checks came on time. But Lloyd had a system. Buy the most wheat during the week when prices were at their lowest. Every harvest, without fail. When the combines started rolling in late June, Lloyd would write the Kansas City Board of Trade price on his chalkboard. Next to it, he'd write his own offer, always 8 to 12 cents below the board price. Farmers complained, but they sold anyway. It was either Lloyd or the elevator in Salina, 40 miles east, and the drive out there ate up the difference. 3 different people told the story of what happened at Dinah's Café that June evening, and they each told it differently. But there's one scene they all agreed on. Lloyd Kessler was sitting at his corner table, daily harvest report finished, drinking his coffee. The conversation turned to Glenn. Dale Webber, partner in the big operation out on Highway 18, said, "Hadley didn't come in again today." Lloyd set his spoon on the rim of his cup, smiled slightly, and said, "Glenn Hadley thinks he's going to store his wheat in that rusty tin can of his and sell it in February for $2 a bushel. He did the same thing in '68. Did it in '65 too. Price never got that high. But Glenn's got one quality. He never gets tired of making the same mistake." A few men at the table laughed. Everyone who heard Lloyd's words that day filed Glenn Hadley's name away as a kind of symbol for stubbornness. Glenn knew it. In a small town, you don't need someone to come tell you the elevator man thinks you're a fool. You can read it in the glances, in the half-second delay when people say hello. And he did nothing about it, because he also knew the second thing his grandfather had taught him. The best way to prove you're right is to stop trying to prove you're right. Glenn's rusty tin can was actually 2 galvanized steel grain bins on the southeast corner of his farm. The first was an old 3,000-bushel Butler bin that August had built in 1947. Round, corrugated sheet steel, cone roof. The second was a smaller 2,500-bushel bin Glenn had picked up for $140 at a farm auction in Gorham in 1961. Total capacity, 5,500 bushels, just over half of his annual harvest, which ran about 8,900 bushels at 28 bushels per acre on 320 acres. He had to sell the rest. But being able to store even half was unusual for Russell County, because storing grain properly is harder than buying it. Wheat that goes into a bin above 14% moisture will grow mold. If you don't control the temperature, heat builds up in the center of the grain mass, creates what's called a hot spot, and within weeks the middle of that bin turns dark and unsellable. Every June, 2 weeks before harvest, Glenn would climb inside those bins, pull up the floor grates, sweep out the old grain residue, check the seals, run the aeration fan and feel the airflow against the back of his hand. He measured moisture with a handheld meter he'd bought for $16. His notebook held the records for every year. June 23rd, 1972. Bin 1. Intake moisture 12.8%. Air temp 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Fan on at 4 a.m., off at 9. He didn't know another farmer who kept records like that. But the bins and August's words weren't the only reason Glenn drove past the elevator. Glenn Hadley had one thing most farmers in Russell County didn't. He read. Every Tuesday afternoon, he drove to the Russell Public Library and went through the agriculture page of the Kansas City Star, the USDA's monthly grain stocks report, and the Kansas Board of Trade bulletins. He'd been doing it for years. Quietly, without telling anyone. Not as a habit, as a discipline. In the fall of 1971, something in those reports caught his eye. The Soviet Union had made large feed grain purchases that year from the United States, Canada, and Australia. The purchases were significant, but they hadn't moved the market because they'd been placed in small lots through different intermediaries. Glenn came home after reading that report, sat down at the kitchen table, and said one sentence to Clara. "The Russians are doing something." Clara asked, "What are they doing?" Glenn thought about it. "I don't know exactly, but they're buying a lot of grain, and someone who buys that much grain is either stockpiling or running out." Clara looked at him for a long time. "And what does that mean?" Glenn looked through the window at the bins. "It means I'm not selling my wheat this summer." Clara set the kettle on the stove. When she looked at Glenn's face, she recognized what she saw. This wasn't a guess. It was a calculation. She'd been reading that face for 38 years. When the kettle whistled, she poured 2 cups of tea and sat down. They didn't mention wheat again that night. But the next morning, When Glenn walked out to the bins at dawn to check the aeration fans, Clara watched him from the kitchen window and understood something. This summer was going to be different. What she didn't know yet was how different. Because something no one in Russell County knew about was quietly taking shape 9,000 miles away, in the grain belt south of Moscow, and it was going to change the price of Kansas wheat forever. July of 1972 was one of the hottest months Russell County had seen in a decade. The thermometer didn't drop below 100 degrees for days on end. The new harvest was already done. The line at the elevator had cleared out, and the farmers who'd taken their checks were starting to pay down their debts. But Glenn Hadley still had 4,400 bushels of wheat sitting in his bins, and the July heat was that wheat's worst enemy. During weeks when the air didn't drop below 78 degrees even at midnight, the core temperature inside a grain bin climbs, condensation forms at the roof, and moisture rises out of control. Glenn knew this. All through July, he got up every night at 3 in the morning. He'd run the aeration fan, press his hand against the surface of the grain to feel the temperature, push the moisture meter in, read the dial, and write it down in his notebook. 13.1%, 12.9%, 13.4%. Same ritual every night. Clara would sometimes wake up and watch him go. One night in mid-July, when Glenn got out of bed, Clara woke up too. "Is the wheat okay?" she asked. Glenn stopped. "It's fine." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Are you?" Glenn didn't answer right away. "Give me one more month," he said finally. Clara nodded and lay back down. In the first week of August, a small story appeared in the agriculture section of the Kansas City Star at the Russell Public Library. Soviet Union makes large feed grain, purchase from U.S. brokers. A few paragraphs buried in the inside pages. But when Glenn read that line, the paper in his hands trembled slightly. The numbers weren't clear yet. The article said several million metric tons, but the purchases had been made through multiple brokerage firms: Continental Grain, Cargill, Cook Industries. Nobody had put the total together. Glenn set the paper down, took off his glasses, and read the same paragraph 3 more times. That evening, when he got home, he said only one thing to Clara. "It started." Clara set the dish towel on the counter. "What started?" Glenn sat down at the kitchen table. "The Russians are buying wheat, a lot of wheat, from multiple firms all at once." Clara asked, "What does that mean for us?" Glenn looked through the window at the bins. In the evening sun, the metal surfaces glowed orange. "We keep waiting." In September, prices began to move. On the chalkboard at Lloyd Kessler's elevator, the number that had read $1.34 at harvest climbed first to $1.52, then to $1.68. The movement was slow, a penny or two a day, sometimes weeks with no change at all, but the direction was clear. Up. Nobody in the county could see the bigger picture yet. They read the increase as a seasonal correction, the kind of normal rebound that follows harvest pressure, Lloyd included. In October, Lloyd was sitting at Dinah's Café with Dale Weber when the conversation turned to Glenn again. Dale asked, "Hadley still hasn't sold?" Lloyd stirred his coffee. "He hasn't. But he might get lucky this time. Price went up a little. Maybe he'll clear 20 cents a bushel." Lloyd shrugged. 6 months of his life for 20 cents? I bought and sold 200,000 bushels in those same 6 months. Dale laughed. Lloyd laughed too. And neither of them had any idea where that 20 cents was headed. In November of 1972, the story changed. When the USDA finally released the numbers, everyone in Russell County learned the same thing. The Soviet Union had purchased a quarter of the entire U.S. wheat crop during the summer of 1972. 10 million metric tons. The buying had started in July and was completed by August. In hotel rooms in Chicago and New York, between Soviet trade officials and American grain companies. USDA officials had either found out too late or not at all. The press gave it a name, the Great Grain Robbery. And prices were no longer moving in cents. They were moving in dollars. December, $2.10. January, 1973, $2.40. February, $2.78. On the third Tuesday of February, Glenn Hadley left the Russell Public Library and didn't go home. Instead, he turned south on US 281 and pulled into the yard at Kessler Grain and Storage. He didn't shut the engine off. He just stepped out, walked to the elevator office door, and went inside. Lloyd Kessler was sitting behind his desk, phone to his ear, numbers in his ledger. He saw Glenn and lowered the phone but didn't hang up. Glenn stood there, didn't put his hands in his pockets, didn't sit down, didn't smile. "I want to sell my wheat," he said. Lloyd looked at him. "How much?" 4,400 bushels, 2 bins, both full. Hard red winter, scout variety, protein 11.4%, moisture 12.6%, test weight 62.1. Grade, number 1. Something shifted in Lloyd's face. Just for a second, a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe envy, maybe just arithmetic. Then he went back to professional mode. He looked at the board. $2.78. Today's offer is $2.66 after handling and grade. Glenn nodded. "I'll bring the truck tomorrow." They shook hands. As Glenn walked toward the door, Lloyd called after him. "Glenn." Glenn turned. Lloyd paused for a moment. "You stored it well," he said. Glenn said nothing. He tipped his head slightly and walked out. After the door closed, Lloyd realized the phone was still off the hook. The voice on the line asked, "Lloyd, you there?" Lloyd picked it up. "I'm here," he said. But his voice was different. He didn't go to Dinah's Cafe that evening. The next day, Glenn made 2 runs. The bed of that 1958 Chevrolet Apache held about 120 bushels per load. It took 4 days total, 8 trips. Every trip, the scale, the grade test, the check. Total, 4,400 bushels at $2.66. $11,704. If he'd sold that same wheat in June, 4,400 at $1.34. $5,896. The difference, $5,808. In 1973, that was half the value of the John Deere 4010 sitting on Glenn's farm. It was equal to 10 full years of Clara's winter money. It was nearly the entire annual net income of a 320-acre operation in Russell County. And Glenn had earned it without taking on any risk, without borrowing a dollar, without paying a single broker's fee, with nothing but 2 old grain bins, a $16 moisture meter, and a weekly trip to the library. But the story doesn't end there. Stories like this never end where they're supposed to, because the real impact goes beyond the money. Prices kept climbing through the summer of 1973. By May, wheat crossed $3 a bushel. Glenn could have made even more if he'd waited longer, but he never regretted it. "Trying to guess the top is just as dangerous as trying to guess the bottom," he told Clara. "I didn't predict the price. I just didn't sell when everyone else did." That summer, 3 more farmers in Russell County built their own grain bins. The next year, 5 more. By 1975, on-farm storage capacity in the county had tripled. Lloyd Kessler noticed. His harvest season buying volume dropped 30%. Lloyd wasn't a bad man, but his system depended on every farmer having to sell at the same time. Glenn was the one who broke that dependency. Not alone, but he was the first. In 1976, Lloyd added an on-farm pickup service to his elevator, driving out to farmers' bins to collect the wheat himself, covering the transportation cost. He dropped his spread from 8 to 12 cents down to 4 to 6. He had to compete. The market had changed. Glenn Hadley died in 1991 at 73. He left behind 320 acres with no debt, 2 sons, and the Butler bin August had built in 1947. The bin was still standing, still in use. When his older son, Warren, took over the farm, the first thing he did was read his father's notebook, every year from 1962 to 1991. Moisture readings, temperature logs, sale dates, and prices. On the last page in Glenn's handwriting there was a single sentence. His grandfather's sentence: "The man who can store his own grain sets his own price." Below it, a date: June 1972. And below that, one number: $5,808. It would be wrong to say patience always pays. Sometimes the price drops, sometimes the grain spoils, sometimes the market doesn't prove you right. Glenn knew that too. He'd waited in 1965 and 1968 and hadn't caught a big move either time. But he hadn't lost in those years either, because he'd stored the grain properly. Glenn Hadley didn't predict prices. He stayed ready. And when the opportunity came in 1972, from 9,000 miles away, from the dry fields south of Moscow, from secret meetings in hotel rooms, Glenn was ready, because his grandfather had taught him patience, and Glenn had turned that patience into a grain bin. Like Glenn standing in front of his bins at 3 in the morning every night. Was there ever a night you couldn't sleep because of a decision you'd made? Or a time when everyone said you were wrong, and you knew you were right, but couldn't prove it yet? If there was, tell us about it in the comments. And if you don't want to miss the next story, subscribe.